Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, our initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name is Tom, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about procurement reform with our panel of industry experts.
Yeah, I'm Shemaine Harris, Head of Procurement at Pagabo.
And hello, I'm Tim Kerr. I'm a partner at Ward Hadaway.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. So today's event is a Q&A session. We're going to go through some of the main updates that have been brought in by the Procurement Act, what they mean for the future of frameworks, and how you can prepare for those changes. We'd love it if you as the audience could get involved as well. So please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask as many questions as you'd like. It's a really in-depth subject, so we're not promising we'll get to the questions at the end, but we'll try. We're also running a few more polls in today's session than we normally do, as we'd really like your responses and your feedback to inform the Pagabo Live schedule for 2025 and beyond. So please make sure you're engaging with them so we can keep delivering that content that really helps build knowledge in the public sector. And as if by magic, here is your first poll question. So this is for our audience. How prepared are you to implement the changes within the Procurement Act? So how prepared are you to implement the changes within the Procurement Act? Scale of 1 to 4, 1 being not very prepared and 4 being very prepared. Just 10 more seconds on that poll, please. Yep, I think we can close that one now. So looking at that, around my quick math, 69% of people are in that lower end of preparedness. Hopefully, with today's session, we'll see a nice positive movement on that and ensure that people are more towards that 3 and 4 section of the sliding scale. So to kick it off, I think it's a really good idea just to get a bit of an update, an idea of the status of the Procurement Act currently. So Shemaine, can you take this one, please?
Yeah, of course. So just giving you a bit of an overview of where we are. So we know that in March, the regulations were laid before Parliament. And then we were working towards an October go live date. So that was recently delayed by 4 months. And the new go live date is now the 24th of February. And the justification for that delay was to allow the time to produce the new National Procurement Policy Statement that aligns with the government's priorities. And that particular statement will set out the government's key strategic policy priorities. And that will come into force at the same time as the Act, late February. To support the preparation for the implementation, the Cabinet Office have issued a suite of guidance documents, and those continue to be issued. And they address all aspects of the new regime. And the Cabinet Office have also issued an official learning offer for public sector bodies. So we know not everybody can gain access to that. So there is also a wealth of free to access webinars and practical guidance documents available to all. And then the enhanced Find a Tender service is in development at the moment, and we are aware that that is in testing phases with some suppliers. And the expectation is that the supplier registration section of the system will be open in late January for submissions, but that has yet to be formally announced.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Shemaine. That's probably worth following that up actually with our second poll question, because that is regarding the training. So the question is, have you accessed the Procurement Act guidance documents and completed the training made available via Government Commercial College? So the answers there, options there are yes on the guidance documents, yes on the training, yes to both, or neither. So yes to either or, yes to both, or yes to neither. Give that one another 10 seconds or so we can get a final few votes in. Yep, and if you could end that poll now, please. So really interestingly, there's 50% of people attending today have not accessed either type of kind of training and upskilling documents. So I think there's still some way to go in terms of where we are with our knowledge on this. That also brings us on to our third poll question in terms of obstacles. So what is the biggest obstacle your organization faces in preparing for the Procurement Act. So is it a lack of clear guidance, although the guidance seems to be available? Is it limited internal resources, budget constraints, the complexity of the Act itself, or any others? You can specify those in the webinar chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So we'll give you a few moments there just in case you've got a chat response you want to pop in. So is it a lack of clear guidance? Is it limited internal resources, budgetary constraints, the complexity of the Act, or an other? And if you could end that poll now, please. So limited internal resources leading the way there. More than half of respondents have said there that the internal resources, which we know is a huge challenge within local authorities and the public sector as a whole, but also 53% say the complexity of the Act itself has been a barrier and an obstacle for the organisation preparing. So again, interesting responses there, and hopefully something we can help clear up with our content today, and also stuff that we're going to do for you going forward as part of Pagabo Live. So we'll look now at pre-market engagement. So what does pre-market engagement look like under the Procurement Act? We'll go to you first in this one again, Shemaine, but it'd be good to hear from you on this one as well, Tim.
Yeah, so it's worth noting that the new regime, it doesn't revolutionise pre-market engagement, but it does introduce some new mandated steps and guidance on how pre-market engagement should be conducted and recorded. So the preliminary market engagement under the Act takes place before the publication of the tender notice, which is what we know under PCR as the contract notice, or the new transparency notice. And with any engagement, it's intended to support contracting authorities and the market to prepare for the procurement. So the preliminary market engagement, it's not mandated, but if it is conducted, then the new preliminary engagement notice must be issued either prior to the new tender notice, and that notice has two purposes. One, to announce the intention to conduct pre-market engagement, and two, to notify the market that pre-market engagement has taken place. If pre-market engagement notice is not issued, then an explanation should be included in the tender notice as to why. One of the key potential impacts of the engagement will be where contracting authorities have the increased flexibility to design and tailor their competitive procurement procedures under the new competitive flexible procedure. And for that reason, the engagement mustn't distort competition or provide an unfair advantage.
Thanks, Shemaine. Anything for you on that one, Tim?
Yes, I think it's worth at this stage just mentioning conflicts and potential conflicts of interest. A bit like what Shemaine just said about pre-market engagement. The new rules don't revolutionise how we treat conflicts, but they do underline the fact that it's important to identify conflicts and then learn how to manage them. And they can be conflicts within your side, you're at the authority perhaps, or conflicts between the authority and a potential supplier. And one of the new things that's been introduced is this idea of a conflicts assessment. So as an authority, you're supposed to undertake a conflicts assessment early on, and indeed keep reviewing it during the procurement process. And not just do you have to do that, but you have to acknowledge at various stages in public notices that you have done that. So when you actually issue your tender notice, you have to confirm that you've undertaken a conflicts assessment. And just a quick shout out, there are some template documents now being issued rather slowly on the drip by the Cabinet Office, and there is a template conflicts assessment document out there, which is quite useful to look at. So bear conflicts in mind.
Excellent. Well, thank you both on that one. We'll stick with you actually for this next one, Tim. So what does the future look like for frameworks under the Procurement Act, and what are the implications for suppliers?
Yeah, well, in some respects, there's not a lot of change when it comes to frameworks under the Procurement Act. We've still got perhaps what I refer to as your standard framework, the frameworks we've all known and loved for many years now. So if you're working under the public contracts regulations, we're used to a framework that's set up by a contracting authority that isn't supposed to last more than 4 years unless there's a specific exceptional case for making it longer. And in certain cases, other contracting authorities can piggyback on that framework and can use it. And then under that framework, you can award contracts by call-off procedures. We'll talk a little bit later on, I think, in this session about direct awards. In general terms, there's not a lot of change there. There are some changes to the transparency requirements. So it's now going to be clear that certain notices have to be published at various stages in the call-off procedure under a framework. That's very important for the government's transparency agenda, that information is made public. One of the big changes is the introduction of a whole new type of framework called an open framework. And one of the criticisms of frameworks to date has been that once you set them up, you're kind of locked into them. So the contracting authority is locked into a fixed list of suppliers. Those suppliers are locked into that framework for the duration, and any suppliers who didn't get on are locked out of that framework for the duration. And in order to kind of get around that, the government's introduced this new concept of the open framework, which can last for up to 8 years, and which will allow for a contracting authority to effectively, I guess you could say, refresh the framework. I mean, it's actually a re-procurement of the framework within the first 3 years. And you might end up, therefore, with new suppliers on that framework. Some suppliers might drop off, new ones might join, and you can keep refreshing actually as often as you like. But instead of it being a framework, it's actually a series of frameworks, but all under the same banner. So that open framework is quite an exciting new development, and it'd be interesting to see how many people use that and why they feel it's important to use. And then the other thing it's worth just mentioning here, whilst the slide only talks about frameworks, we also have this new concept of the dynamic market, which is going to replace the dynamic purchasing system that, again, we've all known and loved for years. Now, the dynamic market is quite a different beast. It's set up in a different way. There isn't actually a competitive procurement to set it up. But once you've set it up, you will have a list of suppliers. That list of suppliers can change because new suppliers can join at any time under that dynamic market. But in order to call off a contract under that dynamic market, you actually have to carry out a competitive procurement, albeit you can limit it to only the suppliers who are on that market. And of course, the one controversial point that's come out over the last few months is that you cannot use a dynamic market for sub-threshold procurements, which is why it's quite a different beast to the dynamic purchasing systems. And I think the jury at the moment is out as to how useful people are going to find dynamic markets. And I think Shemaine will probably back this up. Most people who manage dynamic purchasing systems are busily making sure they're extended so that they can continue to run for the maximum 4 years that they'll be allowed to continue to run after February 2025, because they're very, very popular.
Shemaine, I can see you nodding away there.
Yeah, absolutely. That element around the sub-threshold, that is quite a big change if we look at the uses of DPSs in the market at the moment. So we're exploring all options in relation to that. And I agree with Tim's comments around the open framework. I think it's a really exciting concept, but it is new and it's untested. But it does provide great opportunities for the right scope. And I think it should form part of any pre-procurement strategy in relation to frameworks, in that let's not replicate current processes. Let's actually consider what innovations and opportunities are provided under the new regime, and the open frameworks should be one of those considerations.
Yeah, certainly an interesting few years ahead for frameworks in general. So we'll head on to our next poll, talking about that very topic. Would you consider using a framework provider as a compliant route to market after February? So once the Act changes come into place, so you've got a yes, you've got a no, and you've got an unsure. So don't worry, we're not going to hold you to it if you change your mind. But yeah, if you just let that roll for a little bit longer, I think that's a fairly comprehensive result coming through there. Brilliant. If you could hold that poll now. So as you'll see there, overwhelmingly, 80% of people, nearly 80% of people saying yes, they would consider using a framework. Just the 1%, 2% have said no, they wouldn't look at using a framework after February, and around 20% saying unsure still. So definitely a rosy for the future of frameworks, I'd say, looking at that. Speaking of, that's quite an interesting result there in terms of the future of frameworks. But we're going to do a little bit of myth busting, I guess, now is probably the best way of describing with you, Shemaine. So what are Pagabo managed frameworks? So what's an overview between Pagabo's managed frameworks and those third-party frameworks? What's the difference? Where does the differences lie? What are the benefits and the challenges of either?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting poll result. So as we're moving closer to the implementation, Pagabo are frequently asked questions around how our organisation is categorised under the Procurement Act, because there are some introduction of some new terminologies and new concepts. So the service that Pagabo and organisations like Pagabo provide is to establish and manage framework agreements on behalf of contracting authorities, and aligning that to the new terminology and how Pagabo support contracting authorities. Pagabo are acting as an agent as a contracting of the contracting authority, and that's how it's defined in those guidance documents. Where that differs significantly from third-party frameworks, which Pagabo are not categorised as, is where a third-party framework is essentially created without the collaboration or support of a contracting authority. So it's almost one step removed from that contracting authority, and that's essentially the difference between the two.
Yeah, thank you. So it's good to kind of clarify that, particularly with these definitions changing as they are through the Act. We'll go to you on this one, Tim. Can public sector bodies still make direct awards under the Procurement Act? And what restrictions or guidelines apply to something you referenced earlier, direct award being quite popular? Can public sector bodies still do that under the new version of the Procurement Act?
Well, you might be surprised to hear a lawyer give a very firm answer, but the answer is yes. But I'll obviously expand a bit on that.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got a little longer than just
yeah, we've got a bit of time to cover.
There's plenty to cover. But I think you can do slightly more than yes.
So yes, direct awards can still be made. However, there's been a bit of a change in the language used in the Procurement Act. So let's just think about what we know at the moment. At the moment, there's actually two types of direct award. One that we call direct award in everyday language, and that's what we usually refer to when we're doing direct awards under frameworks. We call them direct awards. There is another set of potential direct awards buried in the current procurement regulations, and for any geeks out there, we're talking Regulation 32, the Public Contracts Regulations, where you can do an award without having to run a competition. It doesn't use the terminology direct award. You can use it without having to run a competition. So for instance, and this is one I've used in the past, where you're doing a contract award to a particular artist because you're procuring a work of art, and obviously you can't compete that. You're going for that artist. For technical reasons, there might only be one person who can actually provide that service to you, or there might be particular urgency reasons why you literally haven't got time to run a competitive procurement, and therefore, provided certain conditions are met, you can make a direct award urgently. As I say, under the current regulations, the term direct award isn't used for those. Now, under the new Act, it's kind of shifted round. We now have specific reference to direct awards, which is in effect a cut and paste of that Regulation 32 I just mentioned. So your urgency, your works of art, your technical reasons, that sort of thing. It includes, for instance, if you started a procurement and no one's responded, you haven't got any bids, you can then go out and negotiate with just one bidder and effectively do a direct award. That is now called direct award. That is in, it's got its own schedule in the Act, Schedule 5. If you're having trouble sleeping, go and read Schedule 5. But actually, it is a cut and paste of the existing rules. What we have until now called direct awards under frameworks is also still there. They just don't call it direct award. They don't use that terminology, but it's still there. It's still pretty much the same. So if a framework has been set up compliantly, there are two ways of awarding contracts. One of them is the lovely mini competition, but the other is, in certain circumstances, you can do a direct award. Now, those circumstances haven't actually changed. The drafting's changed a bit, but essentially it's the same as the current rules, which are that you have to have the core terms and conditions of that call-off contract have to be set out in the framework. So you're not making up a brand new contract. You have to be able to lift those out the existing framework and make an award on those terms. And secondly, there has to be an objective means of appointing the supplier that you're going to give the direct award to. And that's quite important, that objective means. It sadly means you can't just choose the person you like. There has to be a mechanism objectively applied. So that's how you get things like the cab rank rule, or sometimes you get a sort of you rank it by reference to people's scores when they originally bid to join the framework, something like that. So there's an objective means of selecting. So actually, essentially, not a lot's changed, but some of the terminology's changed, and it's been flipped round. That's where we are on direct awards.
Interesting look at the nomenclature there of direct award. Shemay, anything for you to add on that one?
No, I think Tim's covered that really well. We know that it's a very popular mechanism, especially in the construction sectors, and we want to make sure that we can continue to provide that offering compliantly. So yeah, it's a really positive outcome.
Excellent. Well, we'll pop on to the next question then. So again, one for you, Tim, I think on this one, if you could lead on this one. What new mechanisms have been introduced to address poor contract performance, and how will they affect their suppliers and the public bodies that are using them?
Right. Well, dare I say this is a bit controversial, particularly for suppliers, strangely enough. And it's quite complicated in a way, because there are 3 layers to this, and I need to talk about all 3 layers, so bear with me. Just very briefly, the 3 layers are key performance indicators, or breach of contract leading to certain circumstances, or just poor performance of a contract. Those are the 3 layers. So taking them one at a time. Key performance indicators, KPIs. There is a requirement for certain contracts, and this is public contracts with a value in excess of £5 million. There's a requirement for them to include at least 3 KPIs. Now, there is an exception, and the exception is if for some reason you think it's impossible to measure performance by reference to KPIs. Very difficult to understand how you'd be ever spending that much money in the public sector and not be able to measure performance. But anyway, there is an exception, but generally speaking, they would expect a contract that large to have at least 3 KPIs. Now, it doesn't tell you what those KPIs have to be, but importantly, and again, coming back to the government's transparency agenda, when the contract details notice is published, which is published shortly after the contract's entered into, one of the boxes you'll be filling out online will be to describe the KPIs. So not only have you got to set them, but you've got to be transparent about what they are, so the world knows that there are KPIs. And then every year, what you're supposed to do as a contracting authority is publish a notice setting out how your contractor is performing against those KPIs. Now, this is particularly controversial, because you're going to be telling the world whether your contractor is doing well or not. However, you don't just randomly make up an assessment of how they're doing. The procurement regulations, which is a separate set of regulations that was brought out last year, tells you what the ratings are, and it's a bit like what Ofsted was before Ofsted had to change their ways, which they've done recently. There are 5 ratings, and they rate from good down to approaching target, down to requires improvement, down to inadequate, and then finishing up with other. If inadequate is the second poorest, goodness only knows how bad you have to be to hit other. This is clearly controversial, so I won't go into too much more detail because of time. But that's an obligation on the public authorities to make that annual assessment. The next layer down I mentioned was breach of contract. This is something that's actually quite familiar if you're a procurement a practitioner now in the current rules. This applies where there's been a breach of contract by a supplier, and that breach has led to either a payment of damages, some sort of settlement agreement, or even termination of the contract. Now, at the moment, those are possible grounds for exclusion in a later tender, if those circumstances apply. That's been built on in the new Act, and in fact, what the new Act now says is if any of those circumstances happens, there's a breach that leads to one of those things, the public body must publish a notice, so it'll be a public notice that has happened. And it is still potentially a ground for exclusion in later tenders. But the important change is it's out there, it's public knowledge, it's searchable on the new central digital platform. So that's again pretty controversial, and suppliers will be worried that ends up they end up on that register because they've had a fight, a dispute with you over a contract, and they've lost, and a notice is published about it. That's the second layer. The third layer is about poor performance, and this is the one that I think is going to cause the most concern as we go on. And this is where, if an authority believes that a supplier has been performing a contract poorly, inadequately, and has given the supplier an opportunity to improve, and the supplier has not improved, then the authority has an obligation to publish a notice on the central digital platform to explain what's happened. And in that notice, they have to say that this is what's happened, and we gave them a chance and they haven't improved. It doesn't necessarily have to be a breach of contract. It just has to be poor performance that they haven't addressed, they haven't dealt with. That clearly is one that could be difficult to manage. You can see how that could be quite subjective. Some people might think performance is good, some people might think it's poor. From my point of view as a lawyer, what I'm suggesting to clients is don't ever let it be subjective. Make sure you've got the mechanisms in the contract that describe what good performance is, what poor performance is, so that it's clear when the trigger has happened to say it's poor performance. And then make sure there's a mechanism. We'll serve a notice saying your performance is poor, you've got X days, X weeks, X months to improve performance, and then we'll monitor it, and then we'll come back and see. So make sure there's some sort of contractual structure around that, so that you're not just waking up one morning and thinking, I think performance is really bad, I'm gonna publish a notice now. Because my guess is you'll find yourself in dispute with your suppliers if that happens. So sorry, that's a very rapid run through, Tom, of quite a complex area, I think.
That's no, you've done pretty well there to surmise it in as short a period of time as you did there, Tim. That's a really interesting view on that and those new mechanisms and how that poor performance is going to be managed. So we've still got a little bit of time. We've got about half an hour left of our session today. We've had a couple of Q&A questions coming in already, but if you'd like to ask a question to our panel at the end of today's webinar, you can pop it through the Q&A box, which is at the foot of your screen. Just click the Q&A box, type your answer in there, and I'll be passing it on to the panelists at the end of today's webinar. We've also got our polls still coming through as well. So in fact, we've got the next one coming up now. So in consideration of these new contract management requirements, will this change how your organization plans and defines procurement? So the details that Tim's just kind of gone through there. Is that going to change and affect the way that you are looking at organizing those plans and defining your procurement? You around another 20 seconds or so to get your responses in there. But again, there's a fairly overwhelming answer coming through on that. Brilliant. If we could close that poll now. So just around 60% of people are saying yes, that's definitely going to affect the way they define their procurement, and another 28% of people saying not sure. So we're looking at just short of 90% of people saying that it's either definitely going to change the way they approach it, or it's going to potentially change the way they approach it. We'll go to you for this one, Shemaine. So we're going to talk about standstills now. So what's the future of standstills now under the Procurement Act? Has it changed at all?
Yeah, there have been some subtle changes to requirements and processes associated with standstill, and introduction of some new terminology as well. So the new contract award notice will now be issued prior to standstill commencing. So if we think about PCR, the contract award notice is issued 30 days after the contract has commenced. So that's where the confusion comes in, because some of the existing terminology has been maintained, but it's been shifted into a new placement. So the new contract award notice will be issued prior to standstill commencing, and it informs all those interested parties that the contracting authority intends to enter into a contract with the specified supplier or suppliers. The standstill definition remains the same as that period of time between the contracting authority announcing their intention to enter into a contract and actually entering into the contract. The standstill period continues to provide the opportunity for suppliers to raise concerns or formally challenge the award decision before the contract is entered into. Under PCR, the standstill period is at least 10 calendar days, but under the Procurement Act, it will be at least 8 working days. That's a subtle shift there. And the 8 working days will begin with the day on which the contract award notice is published. And the standstill is supplemented by the new assessment summaries. So the need for comparison is gone, but the assessment summary provided to unsuccessful suppliers must include a copy of the information provided to the successful supplier or suppliers, and that can be redacted for confidentiality, but explaining how that tender was scored against each of the criteria. And a supplier reading the 2 sets of information alongside one another should be able to quite easily ascertain the relative advantages of the winning bidder. As I just mentioned, under PCR, a contract award notice is issued 30 days, within 30 days to announce that the contract has been entered into, but that will now be replaced by a new notice, and that is the contract details notice, and that will be issued within that same 30-day period.
Excellent, thank you for that, Shemaine. Anything from you to add there, Tim, on standstills?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just go off on a very slight tangent there, because Shemaine mentioned the assessment summary. That's what replaces what is now a standstill letter, effectively, or any lawyers amongst the group will know it as an Alcatel letter. That's what we've called it over the years. That assessment summary should be a bit easier to write because, as Shemaine mentioned, you don't have to talk about the relative advantages anymore between a losing bidder and the winning bidder. What I want to stress, though, is the importance from a contracting authority's point of view of getting that assessment summary right. And I'll talk about it from the point of view of a losing bidder and the losing bidder's lawyer, because we are often a losing bidder's lawyer. And the first thing you do is you look at the feedback. That's the very first thing you do. And you look at it in great detail, and you compare it to what the invitation to tender or the invitation to negotiate or whatever said, and particularly what it said about the scoring methodology and the criteria, and you pick holes in it. And 9 times out of 10, you find holes, you find problems, and that, of course, gives you a great deal of confidence that you've got something you can challenge as a losing bidder. So to get the assessment summary right is vital to stave off those ambulance chasing lawyers like myself from finding those problems and picking holes. In order to get your assessment summary right, you need to go back in time and get your evaluation right. And that's where often the authorities fall down, because you've set your criteria, you've set your scoring methodology, you've described what has to be done to get a 10 out of 10, you've described what has to be done to get a 6 out of 10 or whatever it is. You set your evaluators away, they then evaluate, they write down their reasons for the scores. There might be a moderation in there as well at some point. Somewhere along the line, it is very common that what comes out the other end in the feedback is totally disconnected to the original criteria and scoring methodology. And that's when the lawyers pick open the holes. Now, if you get the evaluation right and the evaluators take the right things into account, and accurately score against those scoring criteria and the scoring methodology, then when you're writing the assessment summary, you should be able to lift the evaluator's comments out. Literally lift them out, stick them in the assessment summary, because it should all match, it should all flow. Sounds easy when I say it, doesn't it? But the fact is, that is where most of the problems lie when it comes to procurement challenges. That's what gives the bidder the confidence to have a go. And the problem with letting them have a go is if they actually issue a claim and you get into full disclosure, then everything the contracting authority has done behind the scenes is disclosable, and your losing bidder can see it all, and then they find other things they can pick holes in. So you don't want to give them the starting point. So the assessment summary is key, and as I say, it's built on the foundations of a really good evaluation. So quite a big topic. You could probably have a half-day course on this, but I think that's very important. And then if you get your assessment summary right, then as Shemaine said, you've got your contract award notice, your assessment summary, your contract details notice, and hopefully you don't get any challenges, and away you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this really does highlight the importance of the plan and define stages within the procurement. That is essential. And quite often that is the element that is rushed through and isn't prioritised. And that planning and defining stage will really lay out exactly what you want to procure and how you want to procure it, and making sure that there's a commitment and a good understanding of how that will be carried out and the processes that will be carried out under that. It really does start with that pre-market engagement element, you know, having collaborative discussions with the market, understanding what the market looks like. It really is so important to have those discussions early on and make sure that you're allocating the resources to those plan and define stages so that you can sail seamlessly through those procure and manage stages. It really does start at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, Shemaine. And that actually follows on to our penultimate poll question for today. And that is those stages that you as the audience would like to receive more kind of guidance or help on. So whether it is that stage 1 plan, stage 2 define, stage 3 procure, stage 4 manage, or other, if you put that in the chat section on the webinar, you can access that at the bottom of your screen if you have another one there. But it seems that there's a good kind of broad range of responses coming in here. So give you the 10 seconds to sort those out. Brilliant. If you could just stop that poll now. So looking at those results, people seem to be quite happy with the managed stage of it, but stage 1, 2, and 3 all getting equal numbers of people saying we'd quite like to see a bit more guidance and receive more help on. So that's really interesting, and will probably help us define what we're going to do with some Pagabo live webinars later in 2025, because there seems to be quite an opportunity there to build some more knowledge in those areas. And as Shemaine said, particularly the plan and define stages, crucially important if you want to get things right. So we'll wrap up the questions from me with quite a broad one here. We'll go to you first on this, Shemaine, but definitely want to get your thoughts on it as well, Tim. So how can the public sector best prepare for the changes the Procurement Act is going to bring in?
I'll go through the learning and development elements, and then I'll touch on internal and external preparations. So if we look at the learning and development, so we know that to support the preparation, the Cabinet Office have published a suite of guidance documents, which, although there are a lot of them, they are incredibly helpful, and they break down the content into quite manageable chunks, and they're categorized by those plan, define, procure and manage stages. So it was quite helpful and easy to translate that into your internal training materials to deliver internally. And that guidance covers procurement changes, it goes into detail about pre-market engagement. There's lots of examples. Tim's mentioned earlier an example conflicts assessment was issued. So there's lots of really helpful guidance there. And so just want to make sure that that's not overlooked. And then there is some official training aimed at practitioners and commercial policy leads within organisations, aimed at a skilled and an expert practitioner level. But we do know, based on the poll earlier, that not everybody either can access it or has accessed it. So internal preparations, then, I would consider looking at your 2025 and 2026 pipeline if you haven't done so already, and make sure that you're designing a project plan that is built in the appropriate time for those plan and define stages and all of those new procurement activities that you're going to have to undertake, and make sure you've got the appropriate amount of time for the increased administrative burden under this new regime. It's very data focused and publishing of information, so we just want to make sure that organisations are planning the appropriate time into there. Considerations should be made of internal processes and policies, and the resources need to deliver those procurements under the new regime, and getting buy-in from that senior leadership. It's really important not to try and replicate your current processes, and to really take advantage of the opportunities for innovation that are afforded under the new regime. Thinking about external preparations, then, communications are going to be key. So to prep for implementing that Procurement Act and communicating any changes with your suppliers. Where your organisation is not required to issue the pipeline notice, consider the benefits of implementing a similar process and at a similar level of transparency as best practice. So that will really drive getting those best outcomes from procurements. One of the biggest challenges that are going to underpin the delivery of the changes is the new central digital platform, which we're all waiting to see. And we know that it's been tested at the moment, but that includes an enhanced version of the find a tender system, and will grant access to the new notices. We know that the supplier information system will be available to register from the end of January, and it's just thinking about allocating the appropriate amount of time for suppliers to factor in that supplier registration, and to make sure that you're not creating any barriers unnecessarily within your procurements. So that really needs to be considered as well.
Thanks, Shemaine. Excellent stuff. And anything from you, Tim, on how the public sector can best prepare for those changes? Anything to add?
Two things. When I first saw this question, I jotted down the words "don't panic."
Yeah.
Which I think were on the famous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. For any people as old as me, it says on the front of that, "Don't panic." So don't, because everyone's in the same boat, and frankly, it'll take time for some of these things to settle down. Things like the supplier registration, it's gonna take time to get that right. The system that they're trialing at the moment is a little bit clunky. My guess is it probably won't work very well on day one, but they'll get there. So. It will all work eventually. But just coming back to something Shemaine said, and coming back to one of the very early poll questions earlier, I was quite surprised to see that half the people who responded to one of the polls said they hadn't accessed any of the guidance or any of the learning, and yet 35% said that one of the obstacles was the lack of guidance, which I thought was an interesting view of it. I appreciate people haven't got a lot of time, and actually when you click on the Transforming Public Procurement website and look at the list of guidance, you're probably put off straight away by the fact that I haven't actually counted them, Shemaine, but what, about 40 odd different sets of guidance, something like that? There's a lot. But you know what, they are actually quite readable, and I say that in a surprised tone, because sometimes the things that come out of central government aren't necessarily readable, but they are, and I think they've been very carefully thought through and carefully written, and in fact they're already issuing revised drafts of them, I think, because they've taken on board comments that people have said, or they've realized things they missed out. So just the other day, about 4 of them were reissued with some changes. The guidance is readable, and I would actually recommend, if you're not going to do anything else, if you're not going to go into any of the online learning, read the guidance documents, because they are actually very, very helpful. One little point I'd make to any legal listeners to this is, however, it's not statutory guidance, so you can't if you follow it, it won't be a defence if you still preach procurement law. That is quite clear. But nevertheless, to my view, 99% of it is very good, very clear, not at all contradictory to the actual new statutory procurement rules. So if you're not going to do anything else, see if you can set aside a day over your Christmas holiday to flick through the guidance documents. There you go. That's my tip.
Yeah, it's interesting you raised that point about people. I made a note of the same stat that so many people have said they didn't understand it yet hadn't also hadn't accessed the documents. But also a similar stat on those polls which jumped out at me was the limited resources is the reason why they haven't, which I'm assuming is that lack of time that we talk about. Everyone's very under pressure in that public sector at the moment. So a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there of not having enough time to understand the complexity, but also not being able to access the documents that will help you understand that complexity better. So yeah, it's an interesting time. So we're going to go now into our final poll question before we go into the audience Q&A, and I can already see plenty of questions coming in, so we will do our best to get through as many of those as possible. We asked you at the start how prepared you were around the regulations, changes in regulations within the Procurement Act. Hopefully a few more of you will be a bit more prepared than you were at the start of the webinar. So we'll just give that one a few more minutes. Couple of moments there on that one. Let's see how many people we can get to respond. Okay, yeah, if we could close that one now. So interestingly, a lot of positive movement there. At the start, it was mainly ones and twos. We're now into twos and threes. I really appreciate the 5% at the bottom saying that they are now extremely well prepared thanks to this webinar. We do know that there's quite a lot to cover in the 46 minutes we've gone through so far. So there's definitely a lot more that can be done. And I think there's already been a few questions as well around looking at additional areas. So there will be certainly added into the Pagabo live schedule and also the content that Pagabo will have coming out over the coming months. So we'll move into the Q&A now, and I'll just like to put a question. Let's go to you first, and Shemaine, but feel free to jump in on this, Tim. So is the sourcing of a framework in itself a form of procurement? So should this choice be competitive? There's a bit of a framework inception there.
Yes, it is a framework. Sourcing a framework is a procurement itself, so it should be conducted in the same way as any contract procurement in the public sector is conducted. The question around whether it should be competitive, I suppose we've got two routes to market now. We've got the open procedure or the competitive flexible, and it really would depend on the scope of the framework itself, on which route would be the most appropriate route. The open route is tried and tested. We know that. We've worked with that in the market for some time, and the new competitive flexible procedure provides a lot of flexibility and opportunities for innovation in the procurement route. It's a fairly new concept. It kind of groups together all of the previous routes into one. So it really would depend on the scope of the framework.
Tim, anything to add on from yourself on that one?
Yeah, I think that's an interestingly phrased question, actually, because I think you could read it a different way, Shemaine. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything you just said there. You could read it a different way and say, if you're a contracting authority that wants to appoint a contractor supplier, there are a lot of frameworks already in existence out there that you might be looking at to use for your projects. And I guess it could be a question of how do you choose between existing frameworks. There's no law on that. There's no regulation on that. So there isn't a formal competition. But as a contracting authority, I think you need to remember that you've got a public duty to demonstrate value for money and for the management of public funds. So you have to be very careful in your choice of framework. And also, you must do your due diligence on a framework. And this is something that, for instance, I know Pagabo are very good at, in terms of responding to the queries that contracting authorities will raise about the frameworks they manage, so that a contracting authority has got all the information it needs to make that decision. So I think if you're in that position as a contracting authority and you're looking at the host of frameworks that are available, Crown Commercial Services, we know, manage hundreds of frameworks, and there are loads all around the country. Do your homework and do your due diligence on that framework. And one of those aspects is not just the legal aspects, has it been compliantly set up, etc., but also how well is it managed, because it's as a contracting authority, you want it to be seamless when you go in there and use that framework. So do your due diligence.
Thanks, both. We've concentrated quite a lot on the public sector today, as is to be expected with our audience. But we've had a question in from former Pagabo Live panelist as well, Peter Masonbrook, who mentioned that it's not just the public sector that needs to prepare. As a private limited company that works with public sector organisations, they're having to look at the way they respond to bids, adding information to the new digital platform. So, Shemaine, what's the kind of vibe that you're getting from the Pagabo ecosystem and the suppliers on there as to how they're thinking about responding to the changes in the Procurement Act?
Yes, so there is training available for suppliers as well as contracting authorities, and with that, it kind of goes back to my earlier point around the planning and define stages. A lot of that should be considered as part of engaging with those markets, setting realistic timeframes, providing an appropriate tender period. We often talk about a minimum 30 days. It's a minimum. It's not something to aspire to, and it really needs to be an appropriate time frame. For a complex framework procurement, for example, that might not be appropriate. And especially the first few frameworks or contracts procured by a contracting authority, they should really consider adding in additional time to make sure that the supply chain really understand, in those bidder markets, really understand what's expected, understands the new process, it's clearly communicated and transparent, and that there's the appropriate time to carry that project out. And that should support those supplier markets in preparing.
There's a little bit more understanding maybe needed, as Tim said, realizing that everyone in both public and private sector is in the same boat with this and still finding their way a little bit. We've had a question come in from a Colette Broadwith, who's said, and I'm afraid this is beyond my level of comprehension, so apologies if there's anything wrong in this question. The competitive flexible procedure seems quite vague. So what are your views on this? We'll go to you on this, Tim. Colette is working on a very large framework in R&D and is currently nervous about using it and being subject to challenge.
Well, Colette, you obviously haven't been reading the government mantra on this, because the government would replace the word vague with flexible. That's why they've done it, because the idea is you can design your own procedure. Now, I get the nervousness, I get that, and I think that's a common feeling out there in the sector, and I think we're seeing a lot of my clients certainly who are thinking, well, you know what, can we just keep doing what we've been doing and just label it differently? So we've been using, I don't know, competitive dialogue. Can we keep doing that, but call it competitive flexible? And of course, the answer is yes. Nothing to stop you running a dialogue. There's nothing to stop you running a negotiating procedure. There's nothing to stop you mixing and matching those. That's the point of the flexibility, provided that the process you put in place is proportionate, because there's a specific requirement in the Act for your procedure to be proportionate in relation to what you're procuring. At the end of the day, because there aren't any specific process requirements other than some minimum time periods, the need to be proportionate, and then the need to comply with the objectives, which we haven't got time to go into in this session today, but there's a whole list of objectives at the beginning of the Act in section 12 if anyone's interested. Apart from that, you really can be flexible. So I think, don't be nervous if in effect what you're doing is running something you've done before, because it's almost certainly fine to do that If, however, you suddenly think, well, you know what, we can do something radically different to what we did before, then, at that point, I'm not suggesting you should be more nervous, but I'm suggesting you should consider that quite carefully and road test that yourself, stress test it before you go out to the market. Because if you do something radically different, then everyone else is going to be nervous when they see it, and you might perhaps put some people off. Not forgetting, and I'm surprised we're 55 minutes in and we've not mentioned SMEs at all in the last hour. One of the the benefits of the changes is hopefully to encourage more SMEs to get involved. And SMEs probably don't like vague and they don't like complicated. They might like flexible, provided it's relatively simple. So there's that sector or that market to remember as well. So I understand your nervousness, but I think you don't have to change too much of what you've done before.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, we've just got time to get one final takeaway from each of you. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and we'll start with you, Tim. What is the one thing you'd like people who have watched this last 55 minutes? What's the one nugget you can give them to take home with them today?
Embrace the flexibility, because I actually think it's a good thing, and embrace it. And over time, I think you'll come to appreciate it. Put it that way.
And same question to you, Shemaine. One takeaway thought you'd like people to go home with today from this?
It is probably the pre-market engagement and the plan and defined stages of those procurement processes and how essential they are to the success of the rest of the procurement project. So not to discount those stages and eagerly rush through them. Make sure that you're allocating an appropriate amount of time and that you're having those communications both internally and externally, so it's clear what you're planning and what you're doing, and you've got a really sound procurement strategy. I think it's just making sure you're allocating the appropriate amount of time for those early stages.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much for your time today. It's been incredibly informative. There's been a lot to cram into an hour's session and plenty more sessions no doubt to come. So I imagine we're seeing you again on the Pagabo Live panel at some point in 2025. So that is unfortunately all we've got time for today. But thank you very much to everyone that's tuned in. Another really good session and another high number of people tuning in to build some public sector knowledge. So you are all now, if you've joined today, you are part of the Pagabo Live community. So you'll automatically receive a link for our next session in the new year. There'll also be a newsletter coming out, which comes out around a week after each Pagabo Live session. It will have a recording of the webinar in both video and podcast form. So if you really want to, you can even listen to us in the car. And also further insights from the team. We'll also make sure that in there is links to the guidance notes and all of the things that we've talked about today. Thank you generally very much for your support of Pagabo Live in 2024 as well. Your comments and your feedback from today's session will really help us ensure that Pagabo Live remains relevant going into 2025 and talking about the topics that matter to you. As part of that newsletter that will be coming around next week, we'll have a feedback form, which will give you the opportunity to let us know about more subjects that you'd like to hear about into 2025. So all that's left to do is wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year on behalf of the entire Pagabo team. And we look forward to seeing you all again in 2025. Thank you.
Bye.